want to take a moment to talk about shell shock and soldiers during World War I, World War II, and the treatment, specifically about the treatment of shell shock, and or maybe I should also talk about the injuries that led to shell shock and how that's relevant today, and what PTSD used to be called, and what, I'm sorry, I don't remember what shell shock is now called, and why changing names for things is not always good. So it was initially theorized that soldiers exposed to shelling experienced shell shock. And the way they defined it, where the shock wave would injure the brain, what's today described as a TBI, traumatic brain injury, I agree with. And what they thought or theorized was TBI, called shell shock, resulted in complete or partial shutdown of the brain, where some soldiers, the thing with shell shock was soldiers would completely or partially become paralyzed, that the motor cortex would completely or partially shut down, the visual cortex would completely or partially shut down, the sometimes shell shock would lead to soldiers being mute, deaf, incontinent, other symptoms, and and sometimes death, and usually without any physical injuries. And some of those had schizophrenia-like symptoms. And it's well documented. There's many papers written about it by several experts of the time. And the treatment was sometimes 3-4 major treatments. They did use medication, though I think it's important to note the electroshock therapy was often used to treat any of those shell shock symptoms or effects. Besides electroshock therapy, hypnosis was sometimes used, and the other was then called, and you could still find today, information on what was then called Army Major, Dr. Army Major Arthur Hursts Miracle Talking Cure. You could Google Arthur Hursts Miracle Talking Cure, and you'll find information. Why was it a miracle talking cure? Because it talking about the trauma or reliving the trauma. Cured the blind, deaf, paralyzed, mute, incontinent of complete or partial shutdown of the different functions of the brain. So Arthur Hursts Miracle Talking Cure. I think one of the problems is it sounds like it was theorized and accepted that talking about the trauma cured it, though I think there's new evidence that suggests it's not just talking, it's listening. And listening about the trauma helps us think, helps us understand, like often happens in peer support groups. And so the significance of listening is I'm going to reference back to Chris Voss, who's diffused I'm going to say countless millions dollars worth of anger by telling the other person how they feel. Might be hard to believe, should be hard to believe, that telling somebody how they feel about a situation from their perspective, from their shoes, from their point of view. And it's important to consider the different aspects. It's not just from their perspective, it's from their point of view, from their shoes, from where they're sitting. Helps diffuse those emotions, good or bad. And a perfect example is when is labeling the coffee barista's emotions. It doesn't matter if the coffee barista is having a bad day, a hard day, exhausting day, or a good day. Label their emotions and they'll usually always get a great big smile. Thankful, appreciative somebody's acknowledged them. Makes them happy. Even if they're having a bad day, so those are small stakes negotiations. Important to practice the skills all the time so that when you're in a high stakes situation, you're on top of it. It's second nature. And to add to explaining the significance of labeling their emotions, I'll end by talking about Dr. Jonathan Shea, who's retiring. Excuse me, I'll just get off around the corner.
This one?
Yeah, I'll walk across the Thames.
Sure.
Dr. Jonathan Shea says the only way to help vets and the only way vets can heal is in peer support groups. And the majority of what happens in peer support groups is listening to other people talking about the trauma. So,
Yes.
thanks.